You're going to learn a lot of things, or hopefully you're going to learn a lot of things at this conference over the next few days. You're going to be learning by... I was watching some of the pre-recorded talks that I hope you've seen, and just so many insights at different kind of product, kind of prioritization strategy, down to design systems, down to kind of different ways of getting research approved. So there's lots of ideas that I have. And then in one of the forums we were talking about, like, there was a woman who works in a company with 1,000 people, and any time she tries to suggest making a change, it just gets pushed back. So what I want to talk about is turning motivation into action. And that's what can you do about what you've learned to try actually get that applied where you are. So when we survey people after UXDX, 88% of people say they've learned something and they're super motivated and they're really going to go back and try to kind of get that implemented in their company. And the challenge is that, like, we asked them a month later then, kind of going, how's it going? Like, where did you get to? And deadlines and like, oh, we have to get something done and it's not the right time, or something comes up. So the progress isn't being made. And when you think about it, we're not saying doing something completely different. We're not saying it's radically different. If we have waterfall across the top there, we're doing the same thing in product teams or something. We're just changing little tweaks around. We're shrinking down the timelines. We're making it a lot simpler. So the changes shouldn't actually be that complex, and yet they are. And that's the challenge that we face, is like, how are we making those changes, or why is it so difficult to make even kind of sometimes small changes in your process, and what can we do about that? So I like this model from, he's a professor in Stanford called BJ Fogg. And he created a model. He's actually taught a lot of, like, I think people kept dropping out of his class to set up companies that did really successful. But he was saying about habits and how you build habits and how you make change happen. And loads of people think it's about motivation. But motivation is only one of the axes. You can be super motivated, but if it's really hard to do, you're not going to do it. And equally, if something is really easy to do, you don't need that much motivation to do it. So there's kind of like a sliding curve where if you're really motivated, you don't need it to be massively easy, but you need it to be a little bit easy. So when it comes back to the stats of, okay, are people motivated? Well, yes, 88% of people said that they were motivated. So I think we're good on that axis. But then the ability, the ease of doing it, that's where we obviously have the problems. So yeah, if your triggers are there, you succeed, and otherwise you don't. And why is it so hard to do? And this is what I was chatting with. I must get the lady's name. I didn't catch it, but she works at the city of Reykjavik. And she was just explaining that when she proposes a change, then somebody else will go, oh, but that breaks us. And like, if you do that, then that's going to cause problems over here. And then what about this? Or have you thought about something else? And the way I think about it is, companies are a mess. I haven't found a company that's actually structured in a really nice way. And this cup of coffee is my kind of metaphor for how most companies operate. You can pour this cup of coffee. It works. And like, you can build software products. It works in your companies. You're producing software. But it's brittle. And like, any small kind of nudge is going to knock that over, and it's all going to collapse. So people are nervous because people recognize that, okay, if you change that, then it's going to have this effect here, or it's going to knock on there. And how are we supposed to manage that? Because they're not going to do that, and we're going to have these gaps and those kind of problems. So you get these kind of questions of like, how does documentation work? Or, I can't remember them off the top of my head, so I have to turn around. Teams can only move as fast as the pipeline. That's one that frustrates me, when you have lots of teams working separately, but then they have to merge back into the same kind of code base, so you just get blocked by each other. So it doesn't really matter if you start doing something better, you're going to get blocked. How do we know we're solving the right problem? What is my role? That's a big one that I've met with a lot of functional managers, when kind of saying, well, let's try kind of have a bit more autonomy in teams, and they can decide some of the processes. It suddenly becomes, well, if I'm not allocating people to the team, and I'm not telling them how to work, and I'm not kind of in control of the budgets, you're really slicing away at my role here. What are you leaving with me? So there can be a lot of that people are kind of saying, well, what is my position in all of this? And what ends up happening is you end up with water scrum fall or something like that, where we're so agile, we kind of do our sprints and we do our stand-ups and we do our retros, and we're just not moving very fast. And I don't know why, and it must be because agile doesn't work. But it's because we were chatting about this as well, a lot of teams do retros, and retros are fantastic, and I really advocate for them. But in my personal experience of doing retros, I found that there's two classes of problem that come up in a retro. There's one that's within the team's control. So it could be about, okay, if you're handing over there, I'd prefer this, or can we kind of sort this out? And that's fine, because it's just within the room there and within the retro, and people can agree on making some changes. But often the real value comes when you're trying to change what's outside of the team. Like, can we release independently? Can we, as a team, get our code to production and test some, like, we've got an experiment we want to run. Can we just get that in production and test it? Oh, well, no, because you have to go through the change control board. You have to get that signed off. You have to get it merged into the code. It has to then go through production testing. It has to, like, so it's those kind of, that's the real value add when you can start working autonomously, but that's when you start interacting with a lot more people. And from my experience of retros, that's where it kind of, a lot of those go on the parking lot, and you work on the ones that you can do. So you are improving, but you're not making that kind of big step forward. So kind of implementing behavioral changes in a complex environment. And why I kind of say this is, I'm probably the worst person for just trying to break things down into the logical steps. I love maths. I did all sciences. I did computer engineering in university. So like, my brain is kind of very logical, kind of focused. So I look at a problem and I think, how can I break this down? How can I get it fixed? And that works perfectly with a waterfall type of way of working, because it's kind of, let's do a big plan. Let's get everything right, because we don't want to have to do any rework. But when you're changing a company's culture or trying to change how they work, you're not changing kind of a system. It's not a kind of separate entity. It's real people. It's real people, and it's their kind of status with their jobs. It's their kind of, do you have fear? If somebody's asking, you're an expert in something, and somebody asks you to do something else, there's fear in that, well, what if I'm not good at this? What if I can't work in that way? So there's a lot of like human elements involved in change. So it's not kind of as simple as I'm just changing this. You have to kind of start thinking about the human side of it. And the kind of three key things that I say, and if you notice, this kind of looks a little bit like product development, because product development is changing customers' behavior. So this probably isn't my best example of product development workflow, but it's kind of similar, because users, if you are releasing a product, you want users to change their behavior. So what we need to do there is, let's have a vision of what we're trying to achieve, but we're not going to be able to do that in all one go. It was kind of, as Manu said, you shouldn't try to change everything in one go, because it won't work. It's too much for people to take on. So it's great to have the vision of where you're trying to get to, but you need to kind of be able to share that we're going to get there. So a roadmap being, and kind of a vague roadmap, not a very detailed Gantt chart, and then start iterating, because you know it's going to change as soon as you do. But how do you do that with your brittle kind of coffee cup situation? So I was going to say it's happily ever after. If you follow those 3 steps, you'll get your changes done, so you don't have to worry, and I hope everybody can get whatever you've learned implemented. But as we all know, it doesn't happen that easily, because it is that human side. It's nothing that you can plan up front. It's about creating that kind of connections with people, figuring out their problems, figuring out where you can start small, and then get the ball rolling. And this, a lot of people kind of say this phrase that, like, you might have a strategy in plan, but culture eats strategy for breakfast. I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase before, but the concept there is that a lot of companies might say that they want to be kind of psychological safety is a good example, where it's kind of, okay, we need empowered product teams, and we want them to be able to kind of speak up and contribute and share their ideas. But also, if you sit in a meeting in that company and you see what happens when a problem problem rises and it's kind of like shouting and pointing fingers and it can be quite aggressive. Like, that's where the culture, you might say the words that you want empowered teams, but your culture is not enabling empowered teams. My problem with culture as the answer of this, because a lot of people go, you have to change the company culture. Start with the culture. Is that it's nebulous. What is culture? Like, how do I change that? I have to go in and start making people happier, but how do I do that? And luckily, there's a cheat sheet, because KPIs eat culture. People are just reacting to the incentives that they have in front of them. So if we can start looking at the incentives that are leading to particular behavior, so if somebody is a particularly aggressive manager and they get promoted, well, that's telling you that that is valued in that company. So that's what people are looking for. Whereas if you're trying to enable it, you need to put your KPIs that it's all about how can you empower the teams and put in place some kind of things of, the 360 stats on how much the teams feel that they can control, or other metrics of trying to figure it out. But it's about actively thinking about, if we want this culture, what are we going to do and how are we going to kind of put in place KPIs for people that will lead to the culture, because only then will we be able to get to the strategy that we're trying to get to. So that's about kind of the intro to it. The first step, as I said, was setting the vision. And I'm going to give an example here of when I worked with a team in Aer Lingus. And we sat down, we got the whole team together. We just said something simple. It was like, where do we want to be? And we put this kind of chart up on the screen. And we probably had 2 hours just chatting about this chart on its own. So at a high level, across the top, it's just got the typical kind of steps of releasing kind of code out to the system. You code it, you build it, you run you integrate it with all the other components, test them, deploy it, operate. And then the arrows are kind of different kind of buzzwords in the tech industry. Are you continuous integration, deployment, delivery, etc.? And we asked them, well, what does that mean for each of you, and what kind of, where do you want to be? And they didn't actually want to get down to that bottom line. They said that that wouldn't work for them because they're a mobile app team. So if you're doing that kind of continuous delivery where every line of code that you write gets released, that's going to be 1 million updates on your app store. So they didn't want to be releasing to the public every single line of code that they write. Whereas if you're on a website, maybe you do, because you want to get that line of code out to the customer as quickly as possible. But they were thinking about the usability of that. So what they agreed on was, let's get to continuous delivery where we get to choose to press the button. The system just doesn't press that button for us. That seems like such a simple thing. Like, it's just one chart and it's just one line. But that led to so many debates about, well, how would QA fit into that? Like, because it's a lot of automation. Is our QA getting replaced by automated tests? Or how does it work that we can guarantee that after a developer kind of pushes some code, that it is in a releasable, all we have to do is press the button? So that's where it kind of comes down to some of the challenges you feel. And I'm going to dig into that QA one a little bit more, because it comes down to, again, what I said at the start. This is people's jobs. Your job often, as much as we all say it isn't, it becomes part of your identity. So when somebody starts suggesting making changes, that can almost feel like a personal attack, even though it's not. Even if somebody's just looking at how can we change some process or something, the other person can feel like they're being personally attacked. And in this instance, with this example, QA felt that they were being underappreciated. So they thought that they were kind of being blamed for, they were getting pressure from both sides. It was, you have to get quicker, let's automate the things, let's kind of, you're taking too long, but also, whenever anything went wrong, how did you let that slip through, and why didn't you catch that bug, and what are you going to do next time? So all they'd do is they'd add on longer weeks on their estimates, and it was kind of this like friction. And where we got to was, and this took literally months, we said in every meeting from then on, bugs are the team's responsibility, and it's no one person's responsibility. It's not QA's fault, and it's not even the dev who wrote the code. It's like, so we weren't trying to just shift the blame. It was the team, and as a team, we had to figure out how to solve this. And that's great. We said that in the room, and nothing changed. Absolutely nothing changed until we started living it. So we had to go through a few releases. We had to get bugs to come up. We had to get people to see that it wasn't just words. It was actually, we meant it, and every time it came up, that it wasn't reverting back to the old ways of working. So that was kind of just a sideway into setting the vision. But we got as a team, we agreed, where do we want to get to? So now the challenge is, so we've all agreed, but we can't just start working there today or tomorrow. We can't change overnight because there's too much going on. It's kind of, back to as Manu said, you don't want to change too much. Let's change little bits and we can increment. So my favorite tool for this is a user story map. I don't know if you're familiar with user story maps, but the concept, the high-level concept is you create your flow across the top, and this is your high-level flow of what the user is doing through the process. So in this process, our users were actually the development team, and it was the steps that they were doing as they were going through the process. And then you get everybody together, and they put in all the stickies about what would need to change and when and what happens there, and all of these things. So we had a big brainstorming session. But then we said, look, we can't change everything. So we did a prioritization and lifted things up. And that's where you get the swim lanes. So we have release 1, release 2, release 3. So I love this as a practice for product development, but we adopted it for kind of changing process as well. And what we agreed was then we were able to, as a team, say, okay, we're going to change this. And yes, there are those valid questions about what about this, and who's going to do that, and what about the other. But we were able to point to this and say, okay, so that's a valid concern. We're capturing it here, and we've thought about it. And just in the interim, there's going to be this little hassle that we're going to have to deal with. But we have addressed it, and we're kind of thinking about it, but we're just not going to solve it right now. And that was our way of getting people to buy in, because the fear a lot of people were saying, or kind of communicating back to us when we were proposing this, was that it's all going to turn into a nightmare. And like, particularly some function managers were saying they were going to have to swoop in and clean up the mess after we had made a giant mess. So by doing this, it communicated and built trust that, okay, we have thought about it. We're not just kind of seat of the pants, but it's not 100% worked out. So I can't tell you how anything in release 2 is actually going to happen. We've got a few words on a note saying it's something that we definitely have to solve. So if I run through very quickly how we did this in a kind of trying to break it down, we put this one together. And what we started looking at is, okay, in agile development, you could do user story mapping, so that kind of approach that I just said there. And then we realized that, okay, so if I do my user story mapping and I break down my ideas, like, so instead of having a feature that traditionally we would have put together a big project plan and you would have thought about all the moving pieces and everybody would do it. Now if we do user story mapping where I'm saying, okay, we're only going to do this little sliver at the top, that becomes really hard for architecture in a company because the architects typically like to do big blocks of work and they don't have enough capacity to keep flipping every day to look at something else. So we needed to flip to more of an evolutionary architecture. And then how do we do the kind of governance? Because it's back to like a business case. I can't tell you how much time and money we're going to save when we're just in release 1 because I don't actually know how many users are going to use this, if they even like it. But that's kind of the point, is if we find out that they don't like it, then we should stop doing it. So give some interim measures. We can't measure the value directly at this point in time, but we can give some other metrics, cycle time, release frequency, that shows that we're moving in the right direction. And I won't go through every single piece of this, but the idea was to kind of show people that, okay, we've started to think about, we can't just do user story mapping because that impacts architecture. How do we deal then with governance? How do we deal with all these other bits? So it was about the concept of putting in place, okay, this is how we're going to tackle it. And we don't have the answers for the lower level ones. We're just going to start here and we'll figure it out as we go along. So, yeah. Didn't go well. So I presented that, and you think, okay, we've thought it out, but this is what I was saying to kind of that functional manager role. It was kind of, okay, well, you're taking my team, you're taking my process, you're taking everything away from me. What are you leaving with me? And that's where authority was challenged, and it kind of what we realized was team size equals social status. So to people in there, they would kind of say, like, I've got 100 devs in my team, or I've got 50 kind of QA, or they'd kind of talk about their team size as a relative kind of social status in there. So if we said, okay, we're going to carve out teams and put them in separate teams, then suddenly somebody who had 100 people now doesn't. And they don't have as much authority and control. So that feels like it's kind of a social attack. So kind of try to approach it with empathy. The sales pitch I love is I much prefer the job of a functional manager after you have product teams, because you get to focus more on strategy. You get to focus more on your long-term vision. You're not doing admin. It's a nightmare having to figure out, like, I don't know if you've ever had to do it, but if you're working in a project structure and then a project gets delayed and those resources or people were supposed to move somewhere else, but now you can't, and like, people get dragged into weeks of these reorgs, which delivers no value. So that's kind of what we tried to pitch. Worked not so well. That's when we went to the KPIs. So we went the step up and said, look, this is the culture we're trying to build. We're not getting much progress. Can we do something to try shift that culture? And then start iterating. And again, we had problems. So it was great, you've done that. Finance came along and they said, you do whatever you want. I just need the business case with the scope, the sign off, the exact amount of money you're going to spend, how much we're going to return, and then you can do whatever you want. Which didn't really leave us with much kind of scope to kind of iterate and stuff. So we did what any good people will do and fake it till you make it. So we worked with their system, we made these business cases, and then they'd come back and check, how did you do? And of course, what we'd have built would be completely different to what we had put in, but it bought us a little bit of time, and then we could demonstrate some value. So yeah, governance was challenged. They wanted predictability. They wanted utilization. That was a really important one. It's kind of, okay, you put these people in a team. What's saying that, like, because in the project world, it's always, oh, this is more important project. I'm going to steal people from here. I'm going to put them over there. But if they're ring-fenced in a team, you can't do that. So what if one team's really busy and one team isn't as busy? So that was a big pushback. But what we did was kind of said, well, what is governance? So we broke it down to its principles. And governance is two things. Where are we spending our money? Is it working? So what we were able to do with a product team is say, okay, this team is building this particular thing because that's part of our company strategy. How much do we want to invest in that? That's up to you. You can tell me how much we want to invest in this space, and we'll build a team or multiple teams around that. So now we know how much money are we spending, and we know it's aligned to strategy because you're going to tell me how much you want to invest in different areas. Is it working? This is my biggest bugbear of a question, because I don't know if anybody has ever done a business case and the lies that people put into that of how much money you're going to make after you release something. There is zero predictability. If like, I was chatting to a CFO, if they had made every kind of the money that they had made predicted from every business case for the last 3 years, I think they would have been one of the richest companies in the world. So it's not predictable. It's a false predictability with business cases. Whereas with agile teams who are actually really delivering, what you're starting to see is when you get to the stage where they're able to control their own destiny and deliver quickly, you're actually seeing real predictability because you're seeing what's happening, and then they can course correct or learn that, look, we thought this would work and it's not. So let's kill that baby and we'll move over onto something else, which is the hardest thing to do when you get emotionally invested in some project, but you have to make the decision to move on. So what are the key learnings to take away from this? So change is the same whether it's internal or customers. And what I mean by that is I think product development and internal change management are the same problem. And we can use the same tools to address them. Because when you're building a product for customers, you need to make sure that they actually care about it. You need to understand their needs. You need to understand what they're like, what is the pitch that will get them to adopt it. And that's the same thing that you're doing in internal change. You need to understand who the key players are. You need to understand what their concerns, what their motivations are, and you need to get your pitch right to those people. So that's positive because everybody in this room has the first tool set of product development, so we can just reuse that. The second one is aligning on the vision saves countless meetings. And this to me was so true, because I don't know if anybody else has felt this, where you agree something, everything's great, you go on, a week later, you go into a meeting and it comes back up again, and you have the same rehashed arguments over and over again. And it wasn't until we literally had that, and it's such a simple chart, but it worked really effectively, that everybody then started saying, okay, this is what we mean, this is what we're getting towards. So that was our vision of where we wanted to be. We just didn't know how we would get there yet. A roadmap can share the bigger picture, allowing teams to iterate. So that's where that user story map, I wouldn't put dates on that, which is kind of, I know there's the everlasting argument with product managers and a roadmap with dates and sales teams. And you will have probably a bit of a, okay, well, how much time and effort will we invest in this before we're spending too much money? So you need to make sure that you're as lean as possible. But that kind of user story map lends itself to kind of building trust, because one, it's transparent about what you're trying to achieve. Two, you're saying that we're only going to bite out a small chunk initially. And then three, you can demonstrate that you're delivering over time. Because if you just say, okay, we're going to deliver this, and then a month, 2 months later, 3 months later, you're still not really making any progress, well, then you're not building the trust that you need to. So this way of demonstrating and sharing the transparency gets the buy-in, but also keeps people a little bit accountable for following through and actually making change happen. And then, yeah, practice the UX strategies and empathy with your own team. So, as I said, you have the tool set in the room, so try figure out, because often I've chatted to so many people and they're like, oh, the manager just doesn't get it or something. You're like, well, what would you do if somebody said, oh, the customer just doesn't get it and they don't know how to use the product and we just need to train the customer more? Like, you wouldn't accept that as an answer. So if the customer isn't accepting what we're building as a product, we have to say the same thing about our process change that we're pitching. Why is the customer being our manager or somebody else in our org, why are they pushing back? Because that's telling us something about how we're going about it or what those changes are going to do. So with that, I'd like to open up for questions, and apologies again for Sam not being able to join us, but I hope that that was somewhat valuable as a quick replacement. So, thank you.
Wasn't expecting to have to ask this so soon. Just before the pandemic started, we were doing a lot of story maps. We had sticky notes on walls and glass walls and writing everywhere. It was great. And then the pandemic hit and we all went home. And we started using a thing called cardboard for doing our story maps. And we were using the free one, I think, for a little while. And then we started paying for it, but it became very expensive. So we stopped using it, and then the pandemic raged on, and we just kind of forgot about story maps. What's a good online tool for collaborating with story maps, in your experience?
Well, I'm going to do the Figma, our sponsor here today.
We use Figma as well, yeah. But
they can talk to you about FigJam.
Okay.
No, so I don't think you have to go overly complicated with the tool that you use. I like those kind of infinite space whiteboards because it doesn't need a crazy structure, and it just needs to be there so that people can reference it. The challenge I find, though, is that the physical ones are great because it's that kind of, I don't know if you say serendipitous or just kind of subconscious kind of, you're seeing it because it's just there on the wall, so it's hard to ignore it, whereas if it's in just another file, in another folder, in some shared document, people don't see it as much. So it becomes, I think there's two things. I think one, I think the online tools are fantastic because you can get a broader reach. But two, you have to think about what is your comm strategy for it, because if you just make it, they won't come. Like, so you have to be thinking about, okay, can we have this, if we do a stand-up every day, maybe we'll just put that on the Zoom share link and people can see that as we're chatting about, or just try to think of different ways that you can try just get it. You don't have to talk directly to it, but it's kind of like if you were in a room and you had that on the wall, it'd be the same thing as kind of sharing it on the screen. So it's trying to just get people to think, okay, yeah, like this is what it's here. Because there is the risk of it disappearing. But in terms of the tool, I personally just use those kind of like Miro, FigJam, Mural, those type of tools. And the free versions are pretty good.
Hi, I'm way at the back.
Okay.
So I was really interested in your slides where it said about KPIs eating culture for breakfast. And what I felt wasn't in there was about team psychology and the psychology of individuals in our team, because KPIs will only really work with people who are externally motivated and motivated by external factors. You'll always have people in your team who are there for internal motivation. They enjoy the job. They enjoy being passionate about the product, about their role. And you can put KPIs around that run juxtaposition to that, and it will disenfranchise them, it will demotivate them. And so therefore the makeup of your team has to change when you drive it to being KPI driven as opposed to being culture driven, because you lose those people who are internally motivated to do the job they do.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think there's different types of KPIs, and I think it's down to that kind of motivation. There's the intrinsic, extrinsic, internal, external, intrinsic, extrinsic. The carrot and stick, as they say. You're going to get a bonus if you do this, or you're going to get fired if you don't do this. They're terrible KPIs in creative work. They don't work. But what does work is, so there's the internal ones. There's the three that are popular, which is like your mastery, autonomy, purpose. But the fourth one gets dropped a lot, which is relatedness. So that's one thing that I've seen a lot of teams do, which is trying to figure out, well, the KPI is about how we work better as a team. So how can we do that we're building in KPIs about either it's communication or it's sharing, or it's about kind of, there isn't a kind of a simple answer, but you need to make it about kind of the team collaboration, because that's often what it normally is. It's about kind of shutting down or different behaviors, and you kind of make it a value even, that if somebody sees a particular behavior, they address it. But in Amazon, for example, they make their values into KPIs, because that's one of their values is kind of the openness of teams. And if they see somebody reacting against that, like that aggressive putting somebody down, it's part of your KPIs to be living the values. So that's kind of one of the ways that they try to address that. I hope that answered the question a little bit, but it is a big challenge that you don't want to make them metric. You don't want to make it, you're going to get a bonus or you're going to get fired if you don't do this, but it's more about trying to tie into the relatedness of, as a team, we're in this together and this is how we have to kind of work. There's one here.
Yeah, Rory, you said you had a simple chart to align people on a vision. I would love to hear more about the simple chart.
Oh, that was that image that I showed that just, I was just using one example of a team that I worked with where it had that kind of code, release, integrate, test, deploy, and then it was the options of, do we want to, because we were talking about the process we wanted to agree on, and did we want to just be like kind of agile development? Did we want to be continuous integration? Did we want to be continuous delivery, deployment, and then that kind of like 10,000 deploys a day type level? So that, but that's not for every team. That was just that one team in that one example, because I thought it was a great one of, where do we actually really see ourselves as a team? What would be excellent to us? And then we could start trying to get to it. Great. I'm around, obviously, for the next few days, so we're out of time. But if you do have any questions, I'd love to hear from you. So